Is that how you pronounce your name? Awesome. I see Bethany. Of course, the Neves sisters are back. Do you guys pronounce it Neves or Neves?
It's Neves.
It is Neves? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, and my girl Kelly's here. Thank you for adulting. Ariana's here. Lexi. Deja vu, Lexi. It's good to see you. Daniel Lemley's here. Awesome. Okay, we got a good crew here. Okay.
Wait, can you see me too? This is Adrienne.
Oh, I can now.
Oh, okay.
Let me see if I can modify this because I can only see a few of you at once, and that's not okay. I'd like to be able to see most of you most of the time. There we go. Now I can see more of you. Is Miss the Best here? Maddie Best? I don't see her. Okay. She had a question for me and I wanted to address it out loud, but she's not here. Bummer.
Oh, I also sent you a question over the weekend as well.
Okay, remind me your question.
If you're able to include like an outline prior to taking like the quizzes so we know like what part to like review.
Oh, thank you. And so, Adrienne, I don't have study guides for the chapters because the chapters are, well, just one chapter at a time. It didn't cross my mind to have study guides. We actually used to offer what were called self-directed study guides, but unfortunately we now don't have the manpower to do that. So we as faculty had all of our TAs taken away. I don't know if you guys know this, but we faculty had our TAs taken away last spring. And now we can have instructional assistants and IA like Kelly. However, I only have Kelly for a limited number of hours a week, and there are 93 people in the class, so we really couldn't do the self-directed study guide thing, unfortunately, because it's a superior grade. For those of you who want to know what a self-directed study guide is, unfortunately, we can't give you points for it because we don't have time to look at it with all the other things we're doing. But as you're reading the chapters, either on your phone or a tablet, a computer, or heaven forbid, paper and pen, you actually summarize the main idea of every paragraph you read in your own words. And you know, the in your own words part is surprisingly important, even if it's just modification of some of the language, because it actually increases retention noticeably. It's about 75% increase in retention. So unfortunately, we had to modify this class because it's online, and usually my classes have about 20 students in it. We now have 93. So minimally helpful. I'm sorry, Adrienne. I think that it's a great question. And so I would encourage you, if you guys need a study guide, please create your own. It's very, very helpful. Okay, other questions?
Thank you.
You're very welcome, and keep asking those questions.
I have a question.
What's up, Kenzie?
Okay, so I was thinking about this on Friday when we were talking. I'm blanking on his name, but the guy that claimed to have multi-personality disorder or some sort of disorder like that. What's his name again?
His name we gave him was Mr. Sturm, and he claimed to experience dissociative identity disorder.
Right. So my question about that is, how do you go about, because I are aware that he was malingering, but how do you go about telling him or explaining to him that he doesn't really have that mental disorder? Because like that's kind of your job, is to evaluate his behavior and make a assumption slash, I don't know, an assumption about how he is. So how would you go about telling them that that's not reality, I guess?
Wow, Kenzie, that's a very important question. Thank you. I kind of skipped over that at the end. So let me offer some more detail. So as you know, Mr. Ruger and I, of course, not his real name, he and I met, for about 5 weeks total, including this last meeting. And because the report is about him by Indiana law, and by the way, Utah law is the same, because any given record is about you, you become the owner of it, and the person writing the record is merely the custodian of it. So for example, when you go to the doctor's office, your medical records are yours. The doctor's merely the custodian, right? Likewise, as somebody who wrote an assessment on him, the assessment I write, he owns, even though his lawyer was the one that arranged all of it, right? It's about him, therefore he owns it in the eyes of the law. And so I actually sat down with him And I showed him the summary of the biopsychosocial history. The report was 10 pages total. So I showed him the summary of the biopsychosocial history. And then I showed him the diagnostic criteria for dissociative identity disorder, and then point by point listed how it is that he does and does not fit the criteria for that disorder.
Mhm.
And of course, he didn't meet a single one of the criteria for the disorder, not one. And then I showed him the conclusion. So therefore, the conclusion is that you do not have dissociative identity disorder. However, your lawyer asked me for a thorough assessment, so therefore I need to field a diagnosis for what you might be experiencing. And so then I went through with him the diagnostic criteria for malingering. And by the way, he was getting more and more upset as I go through the diagnostic criteria for DID that he doesn't meet criteria for DID, and he's getting more and more frustrated with me. And then when I go over the diagnostic criteria, it's actually not a mental illness at all. But when I go through the definitional criteria for malingering, lo and behold, he meets every one of those.
Mhm.
And he became explosively angry with me. He stood up violently out of the chair in that tiny multi-purpose room we were meeting in. He started calling me very colorful names in terms of my gender, my competence, my profession. I can't remember. Lots and lots and lots of swear words very quickly. And he was very angry. And it was a little stressful to be that close, that in such physical proximity with somebody that upset.
Yeah.
And so the guards started to come and knock on the door like they thought they were going to, have to tase him or something. And I'm like, no, let him be angry. It's important for him to defend himself. He's not threatening me with violence. He's just angry with me.
Yeah.
And so usually, though, psychological, like that's the most colorful one. Usually the evaluations are much, much calmer. And the outcome of the evaluations much, much calmer. One of the things we'll talk about later in the semester is assessing people for, well, to assess whether or not they're sexually safe for other people to be around, particularly children. So when somebody has been accused or detained for a sex crime against a child, one of the things that they are sometimes required to get is a psychological evaluation. And we'll talk in another unit about how you go about these particular evaluations. And I've never had a client in those cases be in any way inappropriate with me, verbally, physically. I've never been threatened or anything else, even if it was clear the implications of my assessment was not what they would prefer vis-a-vis their case. They were respectful about the process. So does this help illustrate what I'm talking about, Kenzie?
Yeah, I was just curious about that because I can see that going through that assessment with them might have them feel like you're discrediting their experience with like their emotional and sexual trauma and stuff, and that's kind of how they're dealing with it. So yeah, that helped, and I was just curious. So
yeah, and I think your concern is valid and important because I was not very validating about Mr. Sturm's extensive abuse, right?
Right.
Fortunately, that's not what the assessment is for.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those where I may feel a great deal of compassion around the abuse, and I was always kind and respectful to him, right?
Mhm.
Very validating of his experience. At the same time, though, when I read through my report with him, it wasn't with an angry or mean tone. It was focused on, here's the question, how do we answer the question?
Right. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Great question. Okay, other questions before we start talking about how the law messes with the practice of psychology, and sometimes in very important ways.
So I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you yet.
Yeah, I have my son who's like crawling on me, and so it's really distracting. So if he had been diagnosed with the personality disorder, would he have been transferred somewhere else, or what would the outcome of it been with him being violent?
Okay, he was not diagnosed with a personality disorder.
No,
Okay.
if he was.
Okay, a personality disorder was never on the table. A dissociative disorder.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, right, you're talking about the dissociative disorder, right? If he was diagnosed with DID.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. Sorry, I was in the weeds there for a second. So if he had been diagnosable with dissociative identity disorder, remember the reason why I don't know that I hope I talked about this. The reason why his lawyer wanted me to assess him is because he committed attempted murder on camera and therefore was going to be charged with a particular violent crime. He was already in prison, but that doesn't mean when you're in prison and you commit a crime that you still don't go through the procedure of justice, right? You still do. So therefore, it would have been a new charge and a new case, just like if he had committed the crime on the street. However, when you're in prison and you commit a crime, the fact you're already in prison is an exacerbating circumstance to whatever crimes you commit in prison. Like, think of it, any crime I commit while I'm in prison is like extra bad. Does that make sense? And so therefore, he wanted to be found, or he wanted to be able to field a claim, a plea called not guilty by reason of insanity, meaning that he would not have been guilty for that crime and therefore it would not have been added to his sentence. But back to your question, what would have happened to him then? And that's a very important question, because if he is so mentally ill that he cannot control his own actions, then he needs to be put in a forensic hospital setting. So he would have been sent to a forensic mental hospital.
Okay.
And for those of you that have worked forensic mental hospitals, I would rather be in a regular prison. Okay. And so there's this myth, like Fox News will say, oh, he was sent to this hospital instead of prison and he just got off easy. And they're thinking of the hospitals they get to go to as wealthy white men. No, forensic hospitals are miserable. It's like the same thing as prison, but with more violently structured behavior. And when you get out of line, they'll just inject you full of drugs for a week, right? That make you comatose. I'm overstating the case, but forensic prisons are not pleasant places. So he would have been referred to a hospital. However, the reason why he was gunning for that is because it would not have increased his prison stay, would not have increased his overall time in prison. Okay, unfortunately, in order to then leave the forensic hospital, he would have to be considered and assessed as sufficiently treated or cured even that he would be safe to leave. Okay, but there's no guarantee that that can happen. We don't get into this issue much in this class, but we have in my abnormal class and a couple of my other classes. There are a series of famous studies when mentally healthy people commit themselves to a mental hospital reporting delusions and hallucinations, and how hard it is for mentally healthy people who then stop the act the second they're inside the hospital. It's very hard for them to get out of the hospital later, because every protestation that, no, I am healthy and I am cured, is met with strong skepticism by the treatment staff, right? And so once you're in a forensic hospital, it's not necessarily easy to leave. So again, Mr. Ruger, Mr. Sturm didn't think this out very well. He didn't, as well educated as he was, as smart as he was, his crime was a crime of impulse and passion. You know, he made this stabby toothbrush shiv the night before he stabbed his lover to death, or tried to stab him to death.
Okay, thank you.
What would have been fun though, and this is kind of like a thought exercise for me, what if he had time to study the DSM and had time to study the law? I bet you he could have fooled me, right? And so, because remember, he's very colorful, he's very charismatic. I bet you he could have fooled me if he'd known what he was doing.
Didn't you say like last time that he had like a 4.0?
Oh yeah, and in a hard program too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's a sharp guy. By the way, although it is impolitic of me to say, one of the things that Grandpa told me that the men in prison later reiterated: never put your dick in crazy. Okay. And then when I went to the women's prison, they reiterated, never let a crazy dick into you. Okay. So just words of your life will be so much simpler if you follow those simple words of advice from my dear old grandpa, as well as the men and women in prison. Okay. So one of the things we get to talk about next as part of Unit 1 is Our knowledge of psychology is informed when we practice in a forensic setting, right? When we're doing something for a lawyer, when we're doing something for a judge, when we're assessing a case for DCFS, right? All of that informs what we're doing. I gave a lot of examples of how it is that being a psychologist in prison really constrains what we can do and what we can't based on the whims of the prison. To talk about how it is that we have actual laws that constrain and govern the practice of psychology. Okay, so I don't know if you guys are familiar with two terms. One term is called confidentiality, and another term is called privileged communication. Okay, can anybody give me an example of confidentiality?
It's only knowledge between you and like the client that you're working with, and you don't share that information with others.
Oh, great example, Adrienne. So Adrienne, let's say that I'm your therapist and you and I are having a really deep conversation about some things that are very substantive and emotionally weighty for you. That night, I don't see you come in with a date and sit behind me at a restaurant, right? I don't see you come in and we're sitting back to back with a booth, you know, the back of a booth between us. And you hear me loudly mocking you and details of your therapy session to my friends. Do you think that that's illegal?
Yes, because you're not supposed to be sharing that information.
Exactly, spot on, right? That confidentiality means that I cannot share by law information shared to me under the umbrella of me being your therapist. Okay.
Unless it's like going to harm themselves or someone else, correct?
Yes, in fact, there are what are called exceptions to confidentiality. The exceptions to confidentiality are threats or imminent harm to self, threats or imminent harm to other people, any abuse of a child, any abuse to an elderly person. Okay, those four are pretty much universal in the country. So let's say, for example, I'm working at the clinic and I know that my given client has a difficult relationship with his father. My client is threatening suicide, calls me on his cell phone and says, I'm driving up the canyon to shoot myself, right? I now have, whether or not the client knows that he has done this, I now have carte blanche to call the ambulance, the police, his dad, Santa Claus, Jesus. Like I can call anybody I want to or believe need to in order to help save his life, right? Same thing with homicide, same thing with child abuse. But now it's put on me as the professional to make sure that those I call, I can have a clinically substantiated reason why I called them. Like when I call Santa Claus, I could get sued for that because Santa Claus has got nothing to do with this particular client's desire to die. Okay. And likewise, if I call Dad and Dad makes the situation worse, then I now need to justify why I called his toxic father. Right? Does that make sense? So
Yes.
I may not be able to make that, so I might be a little circumspect. I might call his mom instead. So I hope that gives some examples. So confidentiality and privileged communication are related. Are any of you familiar with the term of privileged communication? Well, we got a bunch of law-abiding citizens up in here. If you guys had been to jail, you know exactly what privileged communication is.
Matt, isn't that between a lawyer and a client?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Yes, lawyers involve privileged communication, but they're not the only ones. Okay. So if I'm talking to my lawyer and I'm talking to my defense attorney and I totally say, hey, bro, I'm glad you're my lawyer because I totally murdered all of those dudes, that will never come up in court, right? The defense attorney, that's privileged communication. So let's say the judge tries to subpoena the defense attorney to try to get the defense attorney to share all of the secrets and details of my case that I don't want disclosed. The judge cannot do that. That's illegal for the judge to subpoena my own lawyer. to try to get my own lawyer to snitch on me, because any communication between my lawyer and I is legally privileged, meaning that information cannot be legally extracted from those conversations. Okay. So as Adrienne pointed out a minute ago, any conversation you have with your therapist is privileged. So not only is it confidential, not only can the therapist not go blabbing it around all over town, but it's also privileged, meaning that, and in my line of work, this happens from time to time, I'll get a judge will say, you need to come to court and testify about this particular case with one of your former clients. I actually have a form already on letterhead, and what it says is in the state of Utah, any and all communication between therapist and client is not only confidential, it is also privileged communication, meaning the judge can't subpoena that out of me. Okay. In fact, another cool thing about the state of Utah is any conversation you have with your religious leader, whether you're Buddhist, Jewish, Mormon, a Baptist, whatever else, any communication you have with your religious leader under the auspices of meeting with them as a religious leader is privileged communication. Okay. Now, to double down, any communication you have with your spouse in the state of Utah is privileged communication. So my wife knows where all the bodies are of the guys I've had to kill, right? She knows all about that, but it's privileged communication. She cannot be coerced to mention anything about it in a court. The judges can't subpoena that information. There's nothing that they can do about it, right? In fact, if she's on the witness stand at my murder trial and the judge looks at her and says, okay, what did your husband say? The lawyers can immediately object and say, that's spousal privilege. Not every state has spousal privilege, and not every state has ecclesiastical privilege, meaning your relationship with your conversations with your religious leader. Not every state has that, right? But every state has privileged communication with your lawyer. Utah is very interesting because we have more privileges, legal privileges in terms of our communication, in terms of confidential and privileged communication than in other states. So,
Matt, I have
Yeah.
a question. It seems to me, the ecclesiastical privileged communication, does that still have the same caveats where if they know of abuse or they hear of abuse or, against a child or something like that, does that remain privileged communication, or do they have an obligation to say something?
Okay, that's tricky because it's both. So if you all aren't familiar with this, the Catholic Church has had problems with pedophiles who are also priests. And when these priests who are pedophiles go to confession and they confess that they've been molesting children, the church then does not call the police. What they do is they try to intervene with that particular priest, try to move him around, get him some treatment, try to help him change his behavior, right? Unfortunately, there were some priests who were just shuttled from parish to parish and continued to abuse children for many years without their behavior being stopped. And so those priests can serve time, but who the person needing to call the police is the victim. Because of the way privilege works in several states, including the state of Utah, and this is where, by the way, priests and therapists are different. If I'm a priest and I'm meeting with a parishioner and he's telling me about child abuse he's committed, then that's confidential and privileged, and I don't have to call the police. I can if I choose to, but I'm not legally obligated to or legally coerced to. Whereas if I'm a therapist and my client is abusing children, I am immediately required to call the authorities. And what's interesting is it's still confidential, but it's no longer privileged communication. And so when it's confidential, that means I have to be very selective about who I call, right? So I call immediately whoever can get those children to a safe place, and I call police. I do what I can, but I don't call the newspaper. Okay, does that make sense? And so it's really tricky. Now, I want to harp back on the ecclesiastical issue, Julie, because it's such an important point. One of my many informally adoptive daughters, my wife and I were only able to have 3 children biologically, and we've lost one of them, but we have a lot of children. right? Many of them are in their late teens to late 20s now. But one of our girls was severely sexually abused by her stepfather so mom and dad marry when this girl is 11, and stepdad immediately starts grooming her, and between the ages of 12 and 15 he's sexually abusing her. And she is at church and she is bleeding through her skirt because stepdad had just abused her. And her young women's president, this is a young lady who was raised in the Latter-day Saint faith, and her young women's leader sees her and thinks she might need a tampon or a sanitary pad or something, and takes her in the hallway, and the little girl just melts down about everything. She can't keep the secret anymore, everything stepdad's been doing. A young women's leader immediately takes her jacket off to wrap around this young woman's waist, to help protect her. Some people are ashamed of bleeding, and in this culture, I understand that's a shameful thing, even though I don't think it should be, and takes her down to the bishop's office. They go get the bishop out of a meeting. The young women's president and the young woman then tell the bishop what's going on, and the bishop doesn't bat an eye and calls 911, and it was his first counselor that was doing it. So the bishop then gets his first counselor, drags him into his office, sits him down, and is yelling at him and reading him the riot act when the police show up. That bishop cannot be sued by the man who is now in prison, right? Because it's ecclesiastical discretion. So it was on the bishop to decide that, and he decided very much to protect this little girl. Okay, does that make sense? And so other bishops I've noticed aren't necessarily as well trained or have the intuitions that this bishop does, and they might perseverate and hum and haw, and what do I do with this information? And that's understandable, because how many people are trained in forensic psychology, right? This bishop just happened to, he's a plumber actually by trade, but knew exactly the moral, ethical, religious thing to do. So it's tricky. I'm glad I'm not an ecclesiastical leader, and in the state of Utah, unless I start my own cult, never will be. So great question, Julie, thank you. So one of the things we're talking about today is where these particular laws come from. And so the laws around confidentiality actually started in the mid-70s. And so I'm going to tell you guys a story. So fill up your hot cocoa and your cookies, because it's story time. Or is it graham crackers? I can't remember. So there are laws written that constrain our behavior as mental health professionals. So big one, this is when you guys go to graduate school, or if you take an ethics and psychology class, you will know Tarasoff up, down, sideways. It's one of the most important cases in terms of rules around confidentiality that we have. So this is also known as duty to warn. And duty to warn means, okay, if I've heard something, it used to be, okay, we would keep it confidential as therapists. But then what Tarasoff adds is, if I hear something around those 4 exceptions to confidentiality, suicide, homicide, child abuse, elder abuse, that I have a duty to get other people involved, right? Including a potential victim. So, or actual victim, intended victim. So as later goes from duty to warn to duty to protect. I don't know that we'll have time to get into how the law shifted and all of the really heartbreaking cases that involve from going duty to warn to duty to protect, but we'll touch on at least one. Okay, so back in 1969, Prosenjit Poddar is a student at Berkeley, and he meets Tatiana Tarasoff, hence the name Tarasoff case. They were at a folk dancing class, and they were at a New Year's Eve party in 1969, and Tarasoff spontaneously just kissed Poddar, right? To kiss somebody at the stroke of midnight, New Year's Eve to New Year's Day is good luck. Poddar misinterpreted that as a sign of a passionate, committed relationship. She's going to be my lover, she's my wife, etc. Tatiana, quite quickly, because Tarasoff became very protective and clinging at her that night, she established that evening, look, that's not the kind of relationship we have. It's a thing in our culture to kiss somebody at New Year's. It was spontaneous, it was fun, I'm a little tipsy, we're not getting married, okay? So that rebuff over the course of the next week caused an emotional crisis for Poddar, right? Behavioral decompensation. He was having, like, he stopped bathing, he stopped eating, and he started stalking Tarasoff. Tarasoff already had a study abroad trip planned. And in the summer of '69, she goes to South America, my bad. Poddar decompensated even more, like to the point where he started, delusions, hallucinations, signs of paranoid schizophrenia. So a friend actually took Poddar to Dr. Moore, who was a psychologist at Berkeley's hospital. So Poddar informs Dr. Moore of his intent to kill Tarasov and how he was planning to do it. Moore immediately requested a detainment order. He pink slipped him. We'll talk about this later in the term, but when a mental health or medical professional deems somebody unsafe, they're unsafe in their person, right? Their behavior can lead to their own trauma and drama, that they can actually cause what's called a civil restraint, meaning that this person needs to be in treatment and needs to be evaluated, and they can't be let out of the hospital until they are adjudicated as being safe for themselves or others, or safer. So in police custody, okay, and by the way, Moore, as you can see, diagnosed him with severe paranoid schizophrenia. And if you guys remember, we talked about this before, paranoid schizophrenia is characterized by delusions and hallucinations. And back then it actually meant paranoia, like they're out to get me or I'm out to get somebody else. In police custody, Poddar behaves rationally, and Moore's supervisor, without consulting Moore, interestingly enough, recommended that Poddar no longer be detained. I think if they talked to Dr. Moore, he would have had a different opinion. So when Tarasov returned from South America, Poddar insinuated himself back into her life, became good friends with Tarasov's brother, and on October 27th of 1969, 10 months after the kiss, almost 11 months after the kiss, Poddar stabs Tarasov to death in the exact same manner he detailed with Dr. Moore during Dr. Moore's initial assessment. So Tarasov's parents understandably sue Dr. Moore personally, as well as Berkeley University and the Berkeley Hospital. Poddar at the time was convicted of second-degree murder, but the conviction was later overturned on an appeal. The jury had not been adequately instructed in terms of what they should do in such cases. A trial was not held because it was more efficient for everybody just to deport Poddar back to India. Okay, so the rulings of the court, because this Berkeley University, the hospital, appealed and appealed and appealed, so it actually went up to the Supreme Court. And the court ruling was that public peril took precedent over patient confidentiality. So, man, it took a Supreme Court decision. So why do you suppose this was not practiced? Why do you suppose Dr. Moore, having heard a detailed account of how it is that Prosenjit Poddar would stab Tarasov to death, why do you suppose Moore didn't just call Tarasov and her family? What do you suppose constrained you?
Maybe because you already believed that he handled the situation appropriately with already like confining him away from her while she was going off to study abroad. Yep,
that's a great point. That's part of his defense. You nailed part two brilliantly. Do you guys think of any other part by chance why Dr. Moore didn't call Tarasov's family or Tarasov herself?
Well, was there precedent beforehand? Like, obviously it got appealed through the courts, but before that, had there been those exceptions to confidentiality, or did he think his hands were tied?
He thought his hands were tied. That was number one. Okay, between you and Adrienne, you guys should team up, because that's Moore's defense right there. You guys just laid out Moore's defense strategy, and it worked, okay? And so because there was no precedent, he was bound by confidentiality and by law could not call Tarasov or her family, okay? That's one of the reasons why the Supreme Court ruling is so important, okay? And then Adrienne also hit the other half of it, that Dr. Moore's hands were effectively tied. Number one, he couldn't violate confidentiality, and two, he had followed best practices in these cases as far as best practices were documented at that time, okay? So now what we have is exceptions to confidentiality. And when you guys go to graduate school in forensic psychology, clinical mental health counseling, nursing, etc., you'll hear more about this moving forward. Okay, now here is one of the cases that moves exceptions to confidentiality and from duty to inform to even duty to protect. Okay, so we'll tell this story. Duty to warn has become an important part of the practice of psychology. Okay, So one of the questions that is begged then, we've talked about confidentiality and privileged communication. If I'm calling my doctor's office and I'm talking to the front desk staff, or I'm talking to a nurse, or I'm talking to the doctor herself, who has privilege? Who do I have privileged communication with? And this case is partly about that. So Oregon versus Miller, 1985. Miller strangled his lover and called his brother highly distressed. His brother suggested he call his therapist, which Miller did. He first spoke to Ms. Smith, Dr. Seville's secretary, and informed her that he may have hurt someone. He actually strangled his lover to death, so he was kind of understating what he had done. Smith then put Miller on hold, and Miss Smith then called the sheriff's department and got them involved. She then transferred Miller to Seville, who spoke with Miller for 15 minutes, and she assured him that the conversation was confidential. Now, something that is unclear is, did Dr. Seville, did she know at this point that the sheriffs had been called, right? It's not clear. So she then stalled Miller long enough for the police to call back to Miller and arrest him at the phone booth not far from the victim's house. Now, part of Seville's defense is that she didn't know that the sheriffs had already been called, but the prosecution argued that she was stalling for time so that Miller could be arrested. Very interesting. So upon appeal for Miller's murder conviction, he stated that the confessions were privileged, well, his lawyer said that the confessions were privileged. The court denied this, arguing that privilege only exists if there is an intended therapeutic relationship on the part of the therapist. Okay, so therefore, was Dr. Seville Mr. Miller's therapist at the time of the murder? And so the court specified that people included in privilege are those persons that further the interest of the patient reasonably and necessary for communication, right? So let's say you call my office and you're a client and you talk to my admin, Angie. That conversation, because Angie is a vital link between the two of us, that's now privileged communication with Angie, even though she's the admin and not your therapist, okay? So the court also upheld that therapy requires confidentiality and privilege. By the way, there's a dozen major cases at state Supreme Courts where confidentiality and privileged communication between therapists is challenged and threatened. So they also define therapist as a person who is licensed, registered, certified, or otherwise authorized under the laws of any state to engage in the diagnosis or treatment of mental or emotional conditions, or reasonably believed on the patient to be while so engaged. Okay, I want to vent and just rant about this for a minute. There are people out there who are making their money engaging in something called life coaching. Okay, there's a colleague of mine, for example, she went from today she'd be called an Instagram model, but back then it was getting lots and lots of attention on Facebook by selectively showing my butt and boobs to the camera in a way that doesn't get me banned from Facebook. I don't know what that's called, but that's what she did. And she started advertising herself as a life coach. And she has then left the showing my boobs and butt business and into the life coaching business. And she makes about $250,000 a year. She's extremely successful financially. Now, she has a high school diploma. That is the extent of her education. Anybody can call themselves a life coach because life coaches are unregulated. You don't get a license from the state to be a life coach. You don't go to graduate school. There are certifications you can buy, but those certifications are merely sold by the life coach training companies and aren't regulated by the state, okay? If you pay your life coach, you have to pay cash money because no insurance company will reimburse a life coach's time because they don't have a license to treat anybody for anything, okay? Now, why am I ranting about this? One, I'm a little butthurt and jealous that she makes so much money with a high school diploma, purporting to do the exact same thing I do with a doctorate degree, right? I get to be a little butthurt about that, okay? Number two, it's just a very interesting case because one of her clients was engaged in the sale of cocaine, and not small quantities of cocaine. We're talking lots of cocaine. And she was then subpoenaed because he would talk about his cocaine business a lot during life coaching, and she would help him refine his ability to deal in cocaine, right? Because part of what life coaches do is they don't judge, right? And there's nothing legally regulating their professional practice. So if you want a life coach to help you be a better cocaine dealer, go get yourself a life coach to be a better cocaine dealer. Just hope the life coach knows how to do that. And she does. And so she was sued she was subpoenaed by the court, but because the client referred to her as his therapist, and because the client didn't know that there's a difference between a licensed regulated therapist and a life coach, which is unlicensed and unregulated, her case was upheld in court as privileged communication because the client thought she was a therapist. Okay? Nobody else is geeking out about this like I am. I can tell. It's blank faces. This is amazing, right?
Wow.
Does that
because the client thought she was a therapist. Thank you.
does that work similarly for other professions too? Like, what if someone thought someone was a doctor or thought someone was
Yes,
a lawyer?
it applies. Can you believe it?
Interesting.
Oh, man, so
That's crazy.
what was the name of that place? So in the big Wells Fargo building in downtown Provo, there was a series of shops, and one of them was a little restaurant for a minute. And the owner of that particular restaurant, highly narcissistic, highly charismatic. We went there, we had dinner there once, sold Mediterranean food, and never again. He was a little overwhelming even for me. And a couple weeks later, I see in the newspaper that he has been convicted of sex crimes against women because he had rented a doctor's looking office and had the white coat and the clipboard and tablet and everything of a physician, and was giving women low-fee gynecological exams, even though he doesn't even have a high school diploma, right? He was acting like a gynecologist. So therefore, any communication that these women shared with him while he was engaging in this fraudulent, perverse practice of giving them gynecological examinations is privileged communications if the women thought he was a physician. Now, on the one hand, it seems this is silly and stupid, right? On the other hand, you notice how the Supreme Court doubled down on protecting y'all's rights, that if you in good faith think that the person treating you is a licensed, competent professional, you are. In fact, even if you learn later that it's fraudulent and you then later call the police and say, hey, this guy's actually not a gynecologist, no gynecologist. Okay, where did I lose you guys?
Okay, so that wasn't just me, right? It was everyone else.
No, it was me. Did
Oh,
everyone
okay.
go down, or was it just me?
It was right after you said he wasn't a gynecologist is when I lost you.
That's where we
Yes,
lost
he wasn't a gynecologist. Thank you. Okay, so he wasn't a gynecologist at all, but any information that the women disclosed to him while he was a gynecologist is still privileged communication, even though some of the women called the police on him because what he was doing under the guise of gynecologist was obviously not gynecological practice. Okay? So therefore, the women are still protected. And of course, the law then protected them again when the police show up at this man's door and drag him off to jail. So although these laws seem screwy, it's very much about protecting individual rights. Okay? And so if you think your therapist is a therapist, or if you think your doctor is a doctor, if you think your nurse is a nurse, or if you think your front desk admin is a front desk admin, they are in terms of protecting your rights. So let's say I'm the FBI and I'm trying to bust you for a RICO case. And so I know you're distressed. And so one of my agents says, you know, call this Dr. Draper guy, but I'm actually with the FBI, and the front desk admin is actually FBI when you call to make an appointment with me, because I'm going to get you to confess and I'm going to bust you. Okay. You see how that doesn't fly now with the law? If you think that I am actually a therapist and not an FBI agent, then therefore that became privileged communication, and therefore I can't use it against you to bust you. So that's therefore, yep, you can have people disguise themselves as a lot of things, friends at a bar, etc., in order to hear you share incriminating evidence against yourself, but you can always know you can trust your therapist. right? You always know you can trust your priest. So that then doubles down on us therapist types ethically to make sure that we are following duty to warn and confidentiality and realizing our communication is privileged while still knowing what the exceptions to confidentiality are. So that's why our ethics classes are so intense, because we have all of this freedom and we have all of this duty to protect. At the same time, though, we also have all of this duty to warn and all of these exceptions to confidentiality. Okay, any questions to this point? Because I know I just shared a lot of big ideas.
Do you mind going over really quickly the 4 exceptions again? I remember you said suicide, homicide, and there were 2 others.
Oh, yeah, no problem, Maddie. So, in fact, you guys can sing along with me, right? Child abuse and elder abuse, right? Any indication that a child is being physically or sexually harmed, or an elderly person, physically, sexually harmed and or neglected, okay? And an elderly person that is being physically, sexually harmed or neglected. They vary in terms of emotional abuse. It's really hard to assess whether or not somebody's being emotionally abusive. It's one of those things that's like porn. Nobody can define it, but we all know it when we see it, right? Same thing with emotional abuse. So the state laws are a little iffy around emotional abuse, but they're pretty clear on sexual abuse, physical abuse, and neglect. You're welcome, Maddie. Other questions?
I have one. This privileged communication, it's one way, correct? So if a client wants to disclose something, they can?
Yes, but likewise, let's say Daniel, you're one of my clients and I emotionally decompensate during our session and start telling you about all the people I've been hired to kill and where their bodies are buried out in the desert. That is not privileged communication, right? You are not my therapist, and therefore you can call the police. Well, of course, and then you can be subpoenaed and say, yeah, Dr. Draper told me all these crazy things about how he's a hitman for hire, right? It's the defense cannot object because that is not privilege. Privilege is one way. Except between spouses, that is mutually protected. And varies by state, but in the state of Utah, it's protected. They seem to take marriage very seriously here. Have you guys noticed? Oh, but by the way, your spouse can waive that. So I'm glad my spouse hasn't turned me in, but she totally has the right to. So I better be nice to her, right? So this particular form of communication, right, privileged communication, is voluntarily taken up by those who shared the communication. So if one of my clients tells me something in therapy, they can also later tell it to a police officer, right? They are the ones that have the discretion of privileged communication. I do not. Okay. Likewise, if I'm telling my spouse about all the horrible crimes I've committed, she can take that, and then if she's on my side during the court trial, then can wield privileged communication. But she could also very well participate with the prosecution and see me thrown in prison for all the horrible things I've done. You guys get where I'm coming from? That, like, for example, it's quite common that when I'm out with my sweetheart, that former clients will come up and give me a hug. And my wife, of course, never asks, who is that person? Because I may not be able to tell her, but 9 times out of 10, my former clients go, oh, Dr. Draper, and then they turn to my wife, oh my gosh, he was such a great therapist. You know, when we had this thing with my daughter and then my husband was unemployed, he was such a strong source of moral support for my family, right? They own confidentiality. I don't. I can't even add more details, right? I can't add details to that. But you, as the client, own confidentiality. The therapist doesn't. The therapist doesn't own it, therefore the therapist can't say anything. You're the one that gets to flip the confidentiality switch. Likewise, the people you disclose to, what in the world, can then flip the privileged communication flip, right? Your lawyer can't, because that would be gross malpractice, but your spouse can, because they get to do that. Okay. So is it me or are we out of time? Oh boy, we're actually a little bit over. Okay, for those of you watching this video later, I'm sorry I took a little bit of extra time. For those of you that were kind enough to join us here or later, great, good to see you. And I will see you all on Wednesday. So Kelly, thank you for being a rock star superhero. I will see you all.